All right. We are just awaiting a couple of confirmations. Just a moment before we launch. We are live on all platforms and pretty much ready to go. All right. Ahlan wa sahlan. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, depending on where you're at. I am where you would say good evening. My name is Bassam Haddad, and this is the 10th episode of Gaza on My Mind, Gaza ala Bali. In this 10th episode, we address the 300 days of Israel's genocide with Mouin Rabbani, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. It is part of our broader series on Palestine under the title Palestine. This series is sponsored or co-sponsored by the Gaza and Context Collaborative Project that brings together more than 24 institutions worldwide, mostly academic institutions. A quick word about why we're doing this. After more than now 10 months of Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza, there's this expectation that we will go away, that Gaza coverage will be relegated to becoming secondary or tertiary or even worse. However, we are here to say that we are not going anywhere. The conversation about Gaza must continue. We will keep Gaza right front and center on the daily and weekly. Every week, we'll be hosting a free-form engagement like this one on all things Gaza. Today, we host the indefatigable ولا ممكن أقولها مظبوط من أول مرة the indefatigable Mouin Rabbani. أهلا معين.
Hi, Bassam. Great to be with you, as
Very,
always.
very good to be with you, Habibi. Um, Now, we are talking today about a number of issues. We're going to address the current state of affairs in Gaza. We will also look at the ICJ and the ICC rulings, developments therein. A lot of people might have relegated those to um, maybe a less important level, but they are actually quite important. And Moin will tell us why. We'll talk about the tactics of starvation, the targeting of health infrastructure in Gaza by Israel, the targeting of journalists, the targeting of aid workers. We'll talk about the seeming turning point in the regional level, at the regional level, and uh, regarding the ongoing genocide. We will also talk about whether we are at a critical juncture or at the cusp of, frankly, anything. And before I introduce Mu'in, let me just say that we have been witnessing 300 days of genocide. And we are in disbelief not just regarding what we are witnessing, but disbelief regarding how, at least those of us who are living in European or countries or North America, the way this genocide is being interpreted, portrayed, and addressed. It is actually um, a development, an issue, or a record that will stay with us for a long time. And I want it, and we all should want it to stay with us so we can remind everyone who was silent, and certainly those who supported this genocide in due time. Mouin Rabbani is with us to discuss those matters. He's a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He has, among other positions, previously served as Principal Political Affairs Officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, head of the Middle East with the head of Middle East with the Martti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, and senior Middle East analyst and special advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group, ICG. Rabbani is co-editor of Jadaliyya, where he also hosts the Connections podcast, which is remarkable. Now probably has exceeded 100 episodes, and edits its Quick Thoughts feature, which is running on an ongoing basis on Jadaliyya, something that is a record of what has been happening on the weekly in Gaza. He is also managing editor and associate editor of the Journal of Peacebuilding and Development and a contributing editor of Middle East Report. Historically, he is non-resident fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and at Democracy for the Arab World now. Mouin, I know that there's a lot to say about your bio, but we're going to skip that and jump right into the
More than
conversation.
enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump into right into the conversation on Gaza. If you can give us a brief overview of the state of affairs today, and feel free to leave out most of the discussion on the regional situation because we're going to delve into this pretty deeply.
Thank you, Bassam. And if I could just start when it comes to indefatigability, if I pronounce that correctly, I think you're in a league entirely of your own, and your ceaseless energy during, throughout your career, but particularly during the past 300 days has been remarkable and a sight to behold. As you mentioned, we have now entered the 300th day of the Gaza genocide, and I think it's important to briefly go back to the first day, if you will. While it's true that the current crisis erupted on the 7th of October 2023, it did not originate then. Its roots go very much further back. One could even bring in 1948 and the Nakba, which resulted in the formation of the Gaza Strip as a territory, going forward to the 1967 occupation, as a result of which Israel has for more than half a century ruled over the Gaza Strip. And then, of course, particularly the last 20 or so years, during which a relationship between Israel and the Gaza Strip was established, in which the Gaza Strip was pauperized, blockaded, repeatedly attacked by the Israeli military, and essentially turned into what the former British Prime Minister, what even senior Israeli officials have referred to either as the world's largest open air prison camp or even a concentration camp. And this all in the context of reports by the United Nations Development Program and others warning that the Gaza Strip was becoming unfit for human habitation. And that was before October 7th. So it's in that context that the attacks on southern Israel of October 7th, 2023 took place, which Israeli analysts and officials have described as the most painful blow Israel has experienced since it was established in 1948. And Israel's response, I think, was governed by several factors. First and foremost, uh, lust for revenge, an insatiable lust for revenge. And I don't think we can understand what we've been seeing for the past 300 days without understanding this primary Israeli motivation, a determination to make not only Hamas, not only armed Palestinian groups, but to make the Palestinian people, and particularly the entire Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip, pay and pay dearly, and in tens of thousands of cases, pay with their own lives, the lives of their families, the lives of their children, the lives of their parents, for the attacks of October 7th. I think no one expected that 300 days on, we would still be discussing what is happening in the present tense. I certainly believe that Israel expected that it would launch a short, sharp, devastating campaign in which it would achieve its objectives and then declare victory. I also don't think the Palestinians expected that Israel would be able to sustain its genocidal onslaught for the better part of a year. Um, Both because I think it was a Palestinian estimation that Israel would not have the staying power for such a long campaign, and because I think they also looked at previous Israeli onslaughts upon the Gaza Strip in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, which tended to run their course after several weeks or at most 1 to 2 months. And I don't think any of us expected that you would have not only Israel's Western sponsors and allies uh, continue to give unqualified, unconditional support to what is so incontrovertibly a campaign of mass murder, of genocide, with while paying only lip service at best to the need to preserve innocent lives and so on, but also that governments in the region, particularly Arab governments, would assume a position of, collectively, I should add, the position of impotent spectators who, again, have made no more than declarations to try to bring to an end what is going on. And what we've seen is, on the one hand, this extraordinary campaign of mass murder that has effectively transformed the entirety of the Gaza Strip into one mass killing field, combined with an Israeli inability to meet any significant military objectives as those would be defined in conventional terms. Hamas, almost a year on, and despite what I believe is a Israeli campaign whose length was unanticipated, continues to fight as a coherent force, continues to show, to demonstrate, let's say, the basic features of a coherent military organization. Um, uh, its leadership is largely intact. Its battalions and so on, whose destruction and dismantling Israel has repeatedly proclaimed, well, these are still fighting and launching attacks on Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip, and at times Israeli targets outside the Gaza Strip. And what we've seen, in addition to this, let's call it this military confrontation, also an Israeli campaign which is deliberately designed to eliminate, to literally eliminate, the civilian infrastructure of the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth. The systematic destruction of the health infrastructure, of the educational infrastructure, of entire neighborhoods and their housing stock, and so on, under conditions in which there is no armed confrontation. In other words, Israel will establish control over an area and then reduce everything within that area to rubble. And it's quite clear that Israel, at the outset, had an aspiration not only of this insatiable lust for revenge, but as part of that, to expel, to ethnically cleanse the entire population of the Gaza Strip, or at least the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, to expel them from the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Desert, an exodus in reverse, if you will. And when this plan failed, it chose to make the Gaza Strip uninhabitable for human habitation. It's destroying water supplies, the power infrastructure, what little was left of it, these basic sectors of society that are required to sustain organized life and so on. And I think Israel now has the objective that if this campaign indeed comes to an end, and if it's unable to expel Palestinians, those who remain will either die as a result of growing malnutrition, as a result of epidemic disease, which is now spreading rapidly within the Gaza Strip. Most recently, warnings of a imminent polio outbreak, a disease which had been eradicated in the Gaza Strip decades ago, or as we've seen in other parts of the Middle East and Africa, that desperate Palestinians will just get into boats to try to reach, for example, Europe, um, uh, some of whom will succeed and many of whom will die en route by drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. So, that very briefly, well, not so briefly, but that would be my summary of the current situation. I would just add to that that what we're seeing now, you spoke in your introduction that you are working, and quite successfully, I should add, to keep this issue alive and on and burned into everyone's consciousness. On the one hand, it is true that uh, we've now reached a situation where these kinds of daily bombings of designated safe areas, of UNRWA schools where Palestinian civilians are taking shelter, the daily massacres of people in those sites, has become normalized, just as so much else that Israel has done that kind of pierces the norms of civilized behavior and has historically been condemned as such, has now been normalized as an acceptable element of warfare, which is going to have profound consequences in the future. But at the same time, who would have thought that almost a year on from October 7th, where you have the war in Ukraine, where you have the United States presidential election campaign, where you've had all these other major news stories, that this issue would continue to routinely dominate the international news agenda. And I think that's mainly on account of Israel, because every time this issue seems to be disappearing from the headlines, Israel's neo fascist government manages to perpetrate yet another unthinkable outrage. That despite the normalization of all these factors that we were just discussing, manages yet again to put Gaza and the question of Palestine front and center on the international news agenda.
Moin, before we go on, I would like to ask you something um,
Excuse me.
based on simply wanting to know what you think. And even though you and I speak regularly, maybe we can address this right now as well. I've been reading you for a long time, and I'm old. I'm older. Even then, I was still reading you in the 1990s. Um, and I know that you're a very realistic person, and I'm quite realistic as well, and try to recognize reality through a realpolitik lens. But despite all that, despite us not having any illusions about the world, about the discourse of states that claim to be the bastion of X, Y, and Z, that is good. Uh, are, After 8 months, 9 months, 10 months, month after month of mayhem, televised mayhem, are you at all? Are you shocked that this keeps going, and not just keeps going, not just keeps going, but it is increasingly interpreted as legitimate in the circles that we actually live in? not somewhere far away. And we both live in the United States and Canada, which is يعني تابع, which is, it's almost the same thing in terms of the discourse. Are you at all shocked? Before we go to the nitty gritty, I just wanted to pose that question.
It's a very good question, and I have to answer it in both the affirmative and the negative. It is somewhat shocking that even a government as unprecedentedly, unconditionally pro-Israel as a Biden administration, which is led by a president who proudly and repeatedly proclaims himself to be a Zionist, and who can, and whose hero is none other than Golda Meir, the woman who said there is no such thing as Palestinians,
Well, no,
among many other things. Uh, it is somewhat shocking that even taking into account this, let's say, political milieu, if you will, that 300 days into what is the first live streamed genocide in human history, that these governments remain unapologetically committed to seeing this through to the very bitter end. Um, Not going to get into the discussion of why and how, but that on the face of it is shocking. But at the same time, I think this has also revealed um, a quite remarkable chasm between government and governed, between ruler and ruled, in Western states. I mean, just as we may be shocked that 300 days in, these governments are not even going through the motions of pretending to be putting this to an end and holding the perpetrators to account, and so on. What is to me even more shocking, if shocking is the right word, rather what I never expected to see in my lifetime, has been the global outpouring of solidarity with the Palestinian people, often in places where you would least expect it. I mean, when I was in college in the United States in the 1980s, universities were a bastion of pro Israel activism. In 2024, Israel on US campuses has become a dirty word. And in dozens of universities, students have set up encampments to protest not only Israel's genocide, but their own government's complicity with that genocide. Of course, we've also seen it in many Western European countries, in Canada.
I want to
And
interrupt you 1 second,
yeah,
Habibi. Just for the sake of fairness and for the sake of us knowing who we are and the majority of the globe knowing who they are, not just you and me and our networks, when we say that Israel has become a dirty word on campuses, I'd like us to affirm that we're not saying that we are making it a dirty word, just like President Trump made Palestinians and Palestinian a dirty word, because anybody can make anything a dirty word. We're referring how, by its actions, including the killing of 40, 50, and some say over 100,000 people, directly and indirectly, it has given itself a dirty word on US campuses among people of conscience and so on. I just wanted to make that
yeah,
clarification so that
fair,
we
fair.
step
Yes, thank
forward.
you for that. Yes, I mean, people no longer want to be associated with Israel. People no longer, in growing numbers, no longer even feel they can be indifferent to Israel and what it's doing. And this is a combined response to, on the one hand, what Israel is actually doing, that is being live streamed onto their onto their gadgets and phones and tablets and whatever, and televisions. But at the same time, it is just as much, I believe, a response to their own leaders' complicity enabling, support, arming, financing of Israel's actions and Israel's impunity for its actions and Israel's lack of any accountability whatsoever for its genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip.
Absolutely, absolutely. We can also draw, in terms of that analogy, we can also draw comparisons. Being a Jew was a dirty word in Nazi Germany, right? And being a Nazi was a dirty word in Nazi Germany by those who are opposed to Nazism. But being a Nazi is actually a dirty word, period, by virtue of the majority of the world's population because of its actions. Not being a Jew, being a dirty word. That's just what the subjugator, the genocider, the Germans, the Nazis have actually made into a dirty word.
Yes, I mean being a Jew was a crime of identity, if you will, in Nazi Germany and anti-Semitic circles more generally, and that, of course, still exists, but it has been largely displaced by anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Arab racism, and in the past 2 decades, by widespread Islamophobia. And I think these factors also help explain the active support and passive acquiescence of Western governments for Israel's genocidal campaign. If I could just make one point in response to your last question, I think we also need to make a very clear distinction between the international community on the one hand, which is the community of nations around the globe, and that small group of states known as the West on the other. Within the international community more broadly, the recognition that Palestinians are engaged in a legitimate struggle to achieve inalienable rights is decades old. They didn't need the last 300 days to understand, to realize what's going on and draw the appropriate conclusions. Many of these people themselves, or their parents, or their grandparents, have direct experience and memories of colonialism, of counterinsurgency, and so on. So even in places where such states are ruled by autocratic or dictatorial governments, there is a very and always has been, I would argue, a very widespread sympathy for the Palestinian people and their struggle for freedom and liberation. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi, the personification of nonviolent resistance, came out in support of a Palestinian armed rebellion against British rule in the 1930s. That, I think, lays it all out pretty clearly. So, while giving full credit to the extraordinary efforts of students, of labor unions, of other organizations, and of ordinary individuals in the West during the past year to try to put an end to their government's complicity in genocide, I think we also need to recognize that international solidarity with the Palestinian people is a phenomenon that has been overwhelming internationally, and goes back many decades.
Let's go to the first point of discussion, which I hope we can be a bit brief because we have a lot to discuss, and that
Yes.
is the ICJ rulings and the ICC decisions and the that realm of things, whether or not they overlap with international law, and talk about how a lot of people don't assume or don't think that this is significant because it's not as binding and consequential on the ground, not necessarily binding and consequential legally, uh, but it is actually quite important. It's not everything, and certainly not going to be a game changer at the moment, but it is important to follow these matters, and people ignore them at their own peril because they will be brought up, they will be addressed in the future, and they will become precedents for a new world that is now being created by Israel's savage criminality. So, can you tell us a little bit about this and sort of summarize where we're at before we move to what's happening on the ground?
Yes. Well, basically, the world is being confronted with a choice. Does it choose for international law and the universal application of universal norms and values and regulations and rules of conduct in international affairs and so on? Or alternatively, do we persist in prioritizing what the West calls the rules based international order, which is basically the law of the jungle in which might makes right? I will try to be brief, but we're talking about three different cases here. So I'll just explain what each of them is. There are two cases at the International Court of Justice. You can think of the International Court of Justice as kind of the Supreme Court of the international community, and it adjudicates two types of cases: cases between states and also issues what are known as advisory opinions, which is where, for example, the United Nations General Assembly asks the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, to clarify a point of international law or the legal position on certain issues. The ICJ's rulings are binding in interstate disputes. They are, at the very least, authoritative when it comes to advisory opinions. And many would argue that either they are also binding on the United Nations and by implication its General Assembly, or that they are at least binding where they reference provisions of customary international law. So the first case that we're dealing with, and I'll refer to it very briefly because we've discussed it extensively and there haven't really been any new developments, is a case brought by South Africa against Israel, accusing Israel of violating its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention. And in January, the court ruled that South Africa had plausibly accused Israel of genocide. In other words, that there was a plausible case and that it would therefore proceed to a full hearing rather than dismiss the case. And it issued what are known as provisional measures, um, uh, demands of Israel regarding its conduct. And it did so again on several further occasions, most recently in May. And in this case, the court's rulings are binding not only on Israel and South Africa, but they are also binding on every other signatory to the 1948 Genocide Convention, which includes, of course, the United States, United Kingdom, other countries that have been supplying Israel with arms and intelligence, and so on. That case is expected to go on for several years, but I think it's extraordinarily significant that the Supreme Court of the international community has accused Israel, which has used the Holocaust in Europe during the 1940s for decades as a shield to protect itself from criticism of its own racist policies against Palestinians. It now stands accused of, plausibly accused of genocide. In other words, Israel, at least in the public imagination, at least in the political realm, is now no longer seen as a state which can do whatever it wants with impunity and without accountability because it is somehow the response to genocide, but is rather being seen as a genocidal regime that must be dealt with as such. So that's the genocide case, and I won't get into it further at this stage. The second concerns the International Criminal Court. In contrast to the ICJ, the ICC does not deal with disputes between states or governments or international organizations, but it is a criminal court that deals with individual criminal responsibility for a series of crimes defined by the Rome Statute, which governs its operations. These concern war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, and genocide. There are four categories. I'm not sure I got that right. So, since 2021, the ICC has been investigating what it calls the situation in Palestine, which means any crime committed within the occupied Palestinian territories by any individual of any nationality, and any crime committed by Palestinians subject to the Palestinian Authority's jurisdiction committed anywhere in the world. In other words, it can investigate crimes by Israelis or foreign nationals in Palestine and crimes by Palestinians committed in Israel. And in I believe it was May of this year, the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC applied to a panel of ICC judges known as a pretrial chamber for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and three Palestinian leaders: Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated this week, Yahya Sinwar, and Mohammed Deif, who Israel claims it has also assassinated. So that is an ongoing case. Khan's role and that of the ICC more generally has been extremely problematic on this particular issue, to the extent that it has tarnished the credibility and legitimacy of that entire institution. And what we've seen most recently is the British government, um, prior to the elections, asked for permission to challenge the jurisdiction of the ICC, because its claim, the claim of the British government, is that because of the Oslo agreements, the ICC has every right to investigate and prosecute Palestinians, but has absolutely no right to investigate or prosecute Israelis. So, in other words, the British position is Israel must continue to have unrestricted impunity to commit any crime that it desires against the Palestinian people, but Palestinians need to be energetically prosecuted for any infringement that they can be accused of. The court accepted this, and then the court accepted about 60 or 70 more submissions for and against jurisdiction. Of course, leading the pack in defense of Israel was that other genocidal state, Germany, basically making absurd claims that these issues should not be properly investigated until Israel has informed the world that it has completed its genocide, and only then can we begin to basically do a forensic examination of Israel's actions. And it also made an argument known as complementarity, which is basically saying that where a national judiciary is properly investigating the same individuals for the same crimes that they stand accused of before the ICC does not have jurisdiction. Well, of course, no Israeli court has investigated or prosecuted Netanyahu or Gallant for the crimes that the prosecutor has suggested is seeking to arrest them for. So, this is basically a maneuver to gain time in the hope that this issue will eventually go away. And there's also, of course, been the whole scandal of Israel's Mossad intelligence agency spying on ICC prosecutors and staff, seeking to bribe them, seeking to intimidate them. This all came out earlier this year. But so that is a second ongoing issue. The third one also concerns not the ICC, but the ICJ, and this is the most recent one. And in this case, the UN General Assembly in January. So this was not the Palestinians, it was a UN General Assembly by a majority vote, asked the ICJ to issue an advisory opinion on the legal status of Israeli rule in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem. In other words, Is this still a military occupation, which is a recognized status under international law, in which Israel can only be accused of engaging in policies that violate international law? Or is Israeli rule itself, in other words, Israel's very presence in these territories, a violation of international law? And earlier this last month, the ICJ issued a landmark advisory opinion in which it made absolutely clear that even though Israel has not yet formally annexed most of these territories, that Israel's policies since 1967 indisputably constitute a reality of annexation that is intended to be permanent rather than what can be described as a temporary military occupation, that Israeli rule in these territories is therefore by definition illegal, that Israel must leave these territories as soon as possible. And it also placed obligations on UN member states to desist from any enabling of these of Israeli rule in these territories, something which has enormous implications. I mean, if we go back to, for example, the white minority regime, the unlamented white minority regime of Rhodesia, the UN Security Council at the time placed all sorts of restrictions on that racist state in terms of providing its citizens with travel authorization, tourism, investment, and all the rest. So this could have, under the right political circumstances, enormous implications. And I would also add that although the occupied Syrian Golan Heights were not part of this advisory opinion, Israel has already formally annexed the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. So it would be a logical inference that whatever the court decided with reference to the occupied Palestinian territories applies at least as equally to the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. So that was, I think, a very major and significant legal development. Is it going to change anything on the ground before we end our conversation today? Of course not. But it is, but law does not exist in a vacuum. It is not implemented independently of politics, but it is an important quiver in the arsenal of the Palestinian struggle for self determination, for freedom, for liberation that can be utilized, that can be instrumentalized to push their case forward in important and significant ways. It's going to be an enormously challenging effort to do that. But it is a possibility that exists, and that I think Palestinians and others should work very hard to make applicable, to make relevant, to put meat on these bones.
Thanks, Maureen, for this summary. Um, for the past 10 months, on a daily basis, Israel has, uh, um, I, I don't know what to say. I mean, it has outdone itself, which is given Israel's record of crimes against humanity and war crimes for the past several decades, 7.6 to be exact. That's a lot. Whether it is the sheer number of people it killed deliberately, whether it is the destruction of homes, where more than 70%, some say more, of homes in Gaza are destroyed, infrastructure as well, where it has bombed every single hospital, it has bombed to the ground every single university and most schools, where it has starved human beings, where it has directly and indirectly caused the spread of disease, um, where it has controlled every single aspect of Gazans' life every day, from energy to electricity to water, where it has blocked food supply along with its own citizens, settlers, and beyond, which is, you know, which is very important because when we talk about Israelis, we are faulted sometimes for not distinguishing between state and society, which I support. Uh, but Israeli polls suggest that the distinction is actually far smaller than people think, especially if you take out the Arab population, the Palestinian population inside Israel proper, 48. So people have sort of, I'm not saying they tuned out. I'm not saying they are exhausted. We are exhausted and sometimes we tune out, but people always come back. However, even the people who are watching and have not actually gone away, some people have actually, they they started seeing more and more of this as just more and more of the same. So I would like you to talk to us about how to frame what Israel has been doing. We could have done this 6 months in, and it would have been horrific. We're now 10 months in, and it's pretty unfathomable, actually. It's beyond horrific. Can you frame for us uh, the atrocities and how they may be connected, and maybe add some sort of formulation to the connection between them from Israel's point of view, from the IDF's point of view, from the political leadership's and the war cabinet's point of view, because we are on the receiving end watching and witnessing. But there is a strategy, a deliberate intentional strategy, whereby these things together are far more than the sum of their parts in terms of destroying life in Gaza. Can you just talk about those different things from
Yeah.
the policies of starvation all the way to the destruction of infrastructure,
Yes.
healthcare infrastructure, education, and beyond, based on
Well,
what you feel is pressing?
Well, you mentioned that we need to distinguish between state and society, and I fully agree that we need to do that in the case of Israel, just as we would do that in any other case. We, of course, we can't present or represent these as being one and the same thing. That doesn't mean that you therefore have to turn a blind eye to the realities of that society, or deny what is clearly the case in a particular society. And in the case of Israel, we have seen state and society feeding upon each other in the cycle of extremism and radicalization, where it's you've reached this level of racist hysteria that has not many parallels in human history, and I think it's important also to not only look at Israel, its state, and its society in isolation, but to recognize that a primary reason that this has happened and that this has been allowed to happen is that the West has given Israel for decades total impunity for its actions, for its dealings with the Palestinian people, whether that is the invasion of Lebanon, the Sabra Shatila massacres, whether that is the consistently accelerating pace of expansion, of settlement expansion in the occupied territories, whether that is the apartheid it practices against Palestinians, whether that is routine and systematic violation of human rights and international law. So you cannot, I think, give a proper explanation of the cycle of radicalization and extremism of Israeli state and society without assigning a primary role to the impunity and lack of accountability this state has enjoyed over decades. It's almost a natural response, a serial killer who receives a new dagger or machete or shotgun from the police department on every birthday and Christmas is probably shouldn't be expected to stop their killing spree. And I think something similar is going on here. And I think we need to recognize what Israel is, whether is has become, always has been. Israel is a um, irrational, genocidal apartheid state. Um, Irrational meaning that it can no longer take decisions that any neutral outside observer would deem to be in its best interests. Irrational in the sense that it can no longer distinguish between friend and foe. I mean, you read these statements coming from Israeli cabinet ministers, and you would think their biggest foe is not Hamas, but Joe Biden. Um, an apartheid state, I don't need to elaborate on that further because there are very detailed, lengthy, authoritative human rights reports from Palestinian, Israeli, and the leading international human rights organizations that detail why this is so. Genocidal, well, we've already discussed that today. And when you have a regime like this, it forms a threat not only to its victims, and as many would argue, to its own society, but it forms a threat to both regional peace and security and international peace and security. I mean, you now have Israeli cabinet ministers openly speaking of using nuclear weapons. Um, and to talk about enabling, um, the West will not even acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons, even as it's common knowledge and even as Israeli cabinet ministers um, openly speak of using such weapons. I mean, I was, watching a program yesterday in which one of Israel's leading historians, Benny Morris, was discussing an opinion piece published in the New York Times in which he was also advocating for Israel to use nuclear, to drop nuclear weapons against Iran. I mean, how many other conflicts do you know? I mean, do India and Pakistan routinely talk about dropping the big one on each other? Not that I'm aware of. So the state is a danger first and foremost to itself, to the Palestinians, and then not only to itself, but to everyone. And it is a regime, I think, that, as with similar regimes, needs to be dismantled. Um, its society needs to undergo a process of de radicalization so that it can once again join the community of civilized nations. And in the absence of this, I really see no hope for any kind of enduring peace in the Middle East. We've had other examples that are similar that I'm not going to get into now, but we are really dealing with an entity, a state that has become so radical, so extreme, so irrational that it presents a clear and present danger. And this state, together with the policies of its foreign sponsors and allies, has accelerated the process of extremism and radicalization within its society. I'm not sure if that was your question, but that was a point I wanted to make.
Well, that was that was part of the question because it's really important to point out that this is I don't want to say unique. It's not unique. It's happened before, where the
Yes.
genocidal actions of a state have been supported by the majority of its people. It could be that ranks up there in terms of the numbers, reflecting those absolute majorities. Yes, but it's not necessarily unique. But it is unique in an important sense, and that is in reference to the self-professed descriptions of Israel and the description of Israel by the United States as a bastion of XYZ, as the only democracy in the Middle East, as the most moral army. In that sense, it is unique. And what that does is that it increases the gap between reality and rhetoric to the point of absurdity,
Mhm.
right? None of
Yeah,
the,
I mean,
yeah,
look, when you're engaging in genocide, and you get some apologist flunky, like I believe his name is John Spencer, who teaches at some U.S. military college, who's writing all these opinion pieces saying, nowhere in history has an army ever taken such extreme precautions in ensuring the sanctity of civilian life. Um, and yeah, the most moral army in the solar system, the only democracy in the galaxy, and all the rest of it. Well, that is, I mean, these statements are not made in a vacuum. They represent, in my view, criminal complicity in genocide. I mean, if we were to go back to Rwanda, or Germany, propagandists were put on trial, for incitement to genocide. Um, I'm not a lawyer, but I'd be very interested to learn if praising a genocidal army for taking unprecedented precautions, for protecting civilian life, um, constitutes a criminal offense under the Rome Statute. It's You're right. You know what? If you look at these other cases, yes, there was widespread praise for a genocide within the societies of the offending state. But I think what sets Israel apart in many ways is the extraordinary level of foreign support it is getting. I mean, the extraordinary level of genocide denial, the extraordinary level of active praise, for its actions from its Western sponsors and allies and enablers. Not 10 years from now, when the first histories of this issue, are being published and debated,
yeah,
in universities or television stations, but while the genocide is being live streamed, to anyone with sensory perception, to figure out what's going on.
yeah. Uh, so yeah, I did want you to address that point, but I also wanted you to frame for us the connections between the actual policies that Israel uh, and strategies and tactics that Israel is actually carrying out,
Yes.
whereby the connection between them and the totality of what it's doing is far bigger than the actual um, uh, calculation of each on its own. So the sum is much
Yeah.
greater than the total is much greater than the sum of the parts,
Yes.
and the total effect. And here is where we will feel free again, so that we don't have to go back to them one at a time to address these topics that we said we are going to discuss. Um, and let me just say, because it's been an hour, let me just because we don't do advertising, we don't have breaks. Let me just make a public announcement. If you're ever moderating a discussion and you're off camera, and you are in the Middle East where I'm at right now, don't try to have a baklava, especially a really good baklava with the layers well done, not like the imitations where they're all smushed together by excess honey. Non-Arabs do it with honey. I don't know what they're doing. Because then you would have your mouth. I've been doing this with my mouth. So I apologize, and it looks like I've had like I was doing cocaine. I'm not. It's baklava. Just not a good idea. So just wanted to give us a break. تفضل معين
Uh, Thank you for that valuable advice,
حبيبي.
Bassam. Certainly take it to heart. Look, yes, all these, we spoke earlier about Israel being motivated by an insatiable lust for revenge. It is similarly motivated by what it calls deterrence. In other words, to hit its enemies so hard that they will never again. Not only will they never again think of raising their heads above the parapet, but it's also a message to everyone watching. We're making an example out of these people. If you ever think of doing anything remotely similar, you're next. The idea that it's formal enemies, or that the military force with which it is engaged, this case Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the other armed groups, should not just be defeated, but eradicated and wiped off the face of the earth. We've heard all these blood-curdlingly genocidal statements from Israeli leaders, from the very top all the way down. Again, barely a whisper of dissent from their sponsors in the West. And I think all these different elements we've talked about, destruction of civilian infrastructure, mass killings, medieval siege, the deliberate creation of conditions intended to spread epidemic disease, um, the deliberate creation of conditions of malnutrition, starvation, and increasingly famine, basically reducing the entire Gaza Strip to rubble. Um, you know, you challenge us, we will wipe you off the face of the earth. That's the theory here. You will no longer exist. Of course, as far as we're concerned, you never existed. But now that you've objected, we'll make sure you don't exist. The problem for Israel is that, okay, this is a particularly extreme example. As a preeminent Palestinian historian, Walid al-Kharidi has said, Israel has killed more Palestinians in the past 10 months than it has in the previous history of Israeli assaults on the Palestinian people going back to the 1940s. But the problem for Israel is that the Palestinians are never going to surrender. They did not surrender after the Nakba. They did not surrender after the 1967 occupation. They did not surrender after the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, after Oslo, after the Second Intifada. And they are certainly not going to respond to genocide with capitulation. If anything, I think despite the extraordinary suffering, the enormous suffering of the Palestinian people during the past year, and of course, first and foremost, the civilian population, the Gaza Strip, my belief is that what Israel has done has only hardened Palestinian attitudes, and not only Palestinian attitudes, to see this regime called to account in the same way that previous genocidal regimes have been called to account for their campaigns of mass murder.
Do you see the multi-layered, potential multi-layered intentionality? And we're playing devil's advocate now, whereby if you wanted to accomplish uh, the real objectives of Israel in Gaza, which is really not necessarily about Hamas, because Hamas will be replaced by Hamas or other groups that might be more or less the same. But the objective of depopulating Gaza, ethnic cleansing, if that succeeds where people leave Gaza one way or another, that's a major success. If that doesn't work because transfer is not easy, elimination of the entire population is not recommended because that would be like a whole different ball game. We'll be talking about 2 million, not 200,000. If that doesn't work, then making uh, life miserable for people,
Impossible.
beyond miserable. Uh, the idea is that might get them to leave, and if that doesn't work, which is not working because people are not leaving, and of course there's the Egypt situation, which is a whole other dimension, and of course Jordan, is blocked off in the same sense. Um, the third option is to destroy the elements of life: hospitals, schools, universities, bakeries, energy,
The
and
works.
yeah, the works. In addition, you're killing off the people who actually run civil society. They're not more worthy than others in terms of value of human life, but they have a function that is actually specific, and that each of those people addresses a very large number of people in terms of their potential benefit: teachers, lawyers, doctors, and now we know that journalists are almost all but wiped out, but they keep reproducing some, and some of them actually we have spoken with on this and other programs, including this program on Gaza on My Mind. We spoke to with Hind Khudari several times, and she explained to us that this is going to reproduce itself, the shortage of uh, journalists. So it does seem that there is a deliberate tactic, a
Yes.
broader strategy and deliberate tactic to address these goals at various levels based on their potential chances of success at each level, where the most preferred approach is the most difficult to attain. But then there are other ways to do it. And
Yes.
now we enter into the health epidemic issues that will take care of, as in mafia language, of hundreds of thousands of people potentially. It will
Yes.
harm and debilitate tens of thousands of people pretty soon, and maybe even more later. We still are, those of us who are paying attention, we still are witnessing what's happening in Fallujah as a result of the United States' use of white phosphorus and other chemicals in
Uranium.
2003, 4, and 5. So, and depleted uranium. We still have this in southern Lebanon, of course, from the 2006 Israel invasion. So yeah, this is the sort of thing that these 10 months have actually shown us, and I think one of the reasons the expansion of the massacres and the prolongation of the genocide is not just about Netanyahu knowing that if this is over, he will be gone because of his own internal troubles with the law, I guess, in Israel in terms of corruption and whatnot. But it's also something that everyone else is in on, which is why, despite the fissures and schisms in Israel, he is given a lot of leeway that uh, is given because they share these tactics and strategies that they know will make life not worth living for so many people potentially. And the longer you actually go on, the more these realities on the ground will set in, kind of like the uh, racist settlement approach of creating facts on the ground. This
Yeah.
this this is like creating death on the ground.
Yes. And if I could just make two brief
You
points.
could make all the points because I'm just interjecting. You're the one who's making the points. I just wanted to add that.
You
Uh,
know, the, I Thank you, Bassam. But the idea that this war has lasted this long, primarily because Netanyahu is prolonging it, supposedly to stay out of jail, is such nonsense. I mean, we are to believe that the entire Israeli leadership and that is Israeli society more generally, is fully aware that Israel is enduring everything that it is losing in this war and all the costs associated with this war, and is willingly doing so in order to help a corrupt prime minister stay out of prison. That's nonsense. It's much bigger than that. Secondly, since you mentioned epidemic diseases, I mean, we already have now tens of thousands of cases of hepatitis A in the Gaza Strip because of the destruction of the sanitary infrastructure and so on. But I'd like to specifically address polio. My understanding is that its primary victims are going to be the very young, the newborn, infants, because, um, as I mentioned, polio was eradicated from the Gaza Strip quite some time ago. And in contrast to, I think, in some Western countries, newborn children are no longer routinely vaccinated against polio because it's considered um, a disease that no longer exists. Um, in the Middle East and in the Gaza Strip, um, uh, newborns are continued to be routinely vaccinated against polio. And this means that teenagers, adults, the elderly are, according to my limited medical understanding, immune to exposure to the polio virus, which is now making its way around the Gaza Strip. But it is those very young who cannot get vaccinated now because Israel is preventing the delivery of sufficient doses of polio vaccine because so many health workers have been killed because the conditions simply do not allow for any orderly vaccination campaign. So those are the ones who are mainly at risk. Arguably, those are the only ones who are at risk. And then you have someone like Giora Island, or however you pronounce his contemptible name, who has been writing opinion pieces in Israel's leading newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, openly advocating for measures designed to spread, in his words, epidemic disease in the Gaza Strip. Um, Why? Because he feels this will contribute to the necessary catastrophe that Palestinian society, not Hamas, the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip need to experience, and because it will make it easier for Israel to defeat Hamas with less casualties. Imagine this guy's a former general, a former national security advisor. He has so much confidence in his mediocre army that he's openly advocating for mass epidemics because he knows his soldiers can't fight, and they need a and they need a what's it called, an enemy debilitated by disease in order to have a fighting chance of winning. And regarding these other issues you mentioned, aid workers, health workers, university presidents, teachers, journalists, and so on, it does have a certain um, Khmer Rouge quality to it, if you will, of the deliberate targeting of groups of people that, under normal circumstances, help to hold a society together and give it a coherence and a hope for the future. I think that's an important element to keep track of. And regarding, since we've been talking about Western complicity and so on, if you look at what's been happening to Palestinian journalists and you look at the response of Western media, I mean, if this was happening in Myanmar, if this was happening in Venezuela, and I won't even get anywhere near Ukraine, imagine the outrage if in those situations, the Committee to Protect Journalists was reach a conclusion that more journalists have been killed than in any other conflict since records began. Here we're in a situation where the Palestinian Health Ministry will put out certain casualty statistics. The Western media will denounce it as the Hamas-run Palestinian Health Ministry. Since when did they talk about the Trump-run Department of Human Health during COVID? The MAGA health system, the MAGA National Institutes of Health, or whatever. We never saw that, but here it's a Hamas-run health ministry, so they're able to delegitimize it, and then they'll say these figures could not be verified. But what you won't see them saying is that Israel has systematically prevented the entry of journalists, of human rights investigators, of ICC prosecutors, and so on into the Gaza Strip. I mean, if you didn't know this, you would be very hard put um, uh, to inform yourself from mainstream media reporting that Israel has systematically prevented the entry of journalists into the Gaza Strip since at least the 7th of October, with a few exceptions of people who go embedded with an army unit for a few hours.
Thanks, Mouin. Let's move to the last segment and last and most probably on the minds of people watching, at least from the outside, um, and second to the actual pain and mayhem that Israel is causing inside Gaza, and that is the regional situation. We all are very aware, at least our audience, I presume, is that after a barrage of assassinations that have actually started a few months ago but have reached a climax last week, a climax with the killing of Fuad Shukr, who is a commander in Hezbollah, number two, actually, after Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, in terms of a decision maker at that level. And of course, the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, the political head. Um, we can see that this is whatever. I'm not going to get into, and I hope you also don't want to get into what exactly happened, especially in Iran, in the assassination of Haniyeh, because there are so many um, scenarios and speculations about what exactly happened. But I would like to talk about what this moment represents, first in terms of why now, and not necessarily the escalation that is likely to continue happening, because that is in itself a start of a different level of escalation. But I would like you to address how and whether this reflects Israel's power or lack thereof in terms of compensating for actually accomplishing its objectives in Gaza, um, regardless of why the timing is now, anyway, and whether, on the one hand, this is the case. Does it reflect this sort of gauging its actual power? And second, aside from that, whether it is a function of a broader conversation behind the scenes, of course, not a conspiracy. These things happen all the time. Behind the scenes, where the timing of the presidential elections in the United States, where the failure to achieve the objectives which were thought to have, you know, approached an end when Israel was on the verge of entering Rafah, and then they entered Rafah, and then now they're back at it again, from the north back to the south, and from the south back to the north, which means that they have not been able to do what they wanted to do, or even ascertain their claims that they've done what they set out to do in the north and in the center of Gaza. So, is there a conversation potentially that speaks to how this reflects maybe a way out for the Israeli government and Netanyahu after his visit to the United States, where they can claim they have actually been able to accomplish something before actually, beginning to wind down the killing? And I'd like to get your uh, opinion on these two issues, on the question of power and the question of whether this is like a particular juncture or just more of the same, before we
Yeah,
get to escalation, before we get to Iran, Hezbollah, because I'm in the region right now and you can feel it in the air how people are reacting to what's likely to come next. And we can leave that to the last
sure.
question.
Well, I we spoke earlier, or early in discussion. I pointed out that Israel's military is a mediocre fighting force, particularly when it comes to urban combat and these kinds of operations. It has time and again proven itself to be a mediocre force. But having said that, it it has been and remains a very effective and efficient killing machine, primarily against defenseless civilians, as we've been discussing with respect to the Gaza Strip during the past 10 months. But it also has quite a bit of experience at assassinating individuals. And I think these two cases that you mentioned demonstrate that. Israel is able often to assassinate individuals. There are other cases where it's not. The death of Deif still hasn't been confirmed, and even if it is, it took them almost a year to find him. This postage-sized, um, uh, postage stamp-sized territory that is the Gaza Strip, and many other leaders, it still hasn't been able to find. So I think yes, it demonstrates both an Israeli strength and an Israeli weakness. But what it also demonstrates, I think, is that Israel, as with many colonial powers, has a tendency to personalize its campaigns. In other words, the problem is this or that leader who is inciting an otherwise docile population who don't know what's best for them to rebel against their rulers. And the idea is that if you can only kill this person or eliminate that person, things will quieten down and go back to normal. But the record here speaks quite clearly that Israel does have a significant track record of assassinating leaders and senior members. I mean, in Hamas alone, it has sought to assassinate every single leader of Hamas. The first two, Sheikh Ahmad Yassin and Abdul Aziz Rantisi, were killed within a span of 40 days. The third, Khalid Mash'al, was meant to be killed through a poison injection into his ear in Amman in 1997, but his life ended up being saved by Israel after Jordan threatened to publicly hang the Mossad agents responsible in the public square in Amman after they were caught by Mashhad's bodyguard after a long chase through the center of Amman. And now Hania. And what we've seen is, there's a very clear distinction between the successful assassination campaigns of leaders and senior members on the one hand, in contrast to the absolute failure to defeat the movements that they lead. And not only has the assassination campaign not weakened, not defeated these movements, in certain respects, has actually strengthened them. because a movement like Hamas, which has experienced so many assassinations over the years, has become very adept at rapidly replacing those who are removed from the scene with new members who have already been prepared to take their place. So that would be my answer to the first part of your question. I'm sorry, but I forgot the second part.
Well, basically, whether the timing of this
Yes, sorry. No, yeah,
series
sorry to interrupt you,
is
but
is
yeah. So,
is something that is
right.
coordinated. I don't want to say orchestrated, because
Yeah.
orchestrate is a more specific thing, and whether it's coordinated, which means that we are on the cusp of something. And I'm not going to say, the end of the genocide, because the genocide is ongoing, even if
Yes.
the killing stops directly, um, and for other reasons, because of the effects and so on. But whether this is something that indicates a turning point.
Yes. Well, um, that's one explanation that's been given. I'm quite certain that these latest assassinations were carried out in coordination and with the agreement of the United States. I think there can be little doubt about that. Secondly, I'm also quite certain that there are those in the U.S. administration who supported these assassinations because, from their perspective, it would give Netanyahu the scalps he needs in order to provide him with a dignified exit from his military failures in Gaza. In other words, you can now declare victory and go home. And I'm quite certain also that there are those in Israel who presented this argument to their counterparts in the United States and other Western countries in order to generate support for these assassinations. But I don't think that's at all how this is going to play out. We have absolutely no indication um, that there has been any change either in Israel's rejection of any negotiated agreement to end this genocidal onslaught, nor indeed do we have any indication that the United States is about to change its policy towards Israel from one of unconditional, unqualified support for what Israel chooses to do with no repercussions and no consequences on those issues where Israel basically acts in opposition to U.S. Stated U.S. Policy. And so, I mean, that argument would only make sense if you would have seen a real change of position from Israel or a real change of policy in the United States. We have seen neither, and we will see neither. Even more to the point, the United States is now sending significant additional assets to the Middle East. Um, Israel's right to defend itself, quote unquote, has once again become flavor of the month in US and Western halls of power. And so there is every indication that those who supported these assassinations in the hope that they would produce a broader conflict in the region, whether these people be in Israel or the United States, are calling the shots.
All right. Well, it does remain to be seen, uh, how this will play out. And this is the final. I promise you, this is the final segment, and that is, what are the likely scenarios going forward. Those of us who have heard Hassan Nasrallah's speech the day before yesterday can tell that there will be a response. And those of us who are following Iranian politics know from what happened yesterday that there will be an Iranian response. There will also be a Houthi response, a belated one, of course, and Al Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq. Although it is said that this was not a coordinated, four-pronged attack, because the last one was by the Americans, but they might get involved. So the question is, what level of response are we likely to see? From those who have heard Hassan Nasrallah, we know that it's not going to happen right away. We know that the idea is that everyone here today in the region, specifically the Israelis, because the ball is in the hands of the other side, they're at their utmost readiness. And everyone was tuning in for the Hezbollah leader to speak, to see whether actually something's happening at that moment, something that resembles what he said in 2006 when he told listeners upon his appearance on television during that war, the invasion of Beirut or southern Lebanon, and the damaging of infrastructure of various parts of Lebanon. He came on and said, "Look towards the sea. You'll see that one of the Israeli ships is burning as I speak right now because of missiles that were launched um, into that ship, because it was actually launching missiles into Beirut and Dahieh, the southern suburb of Beirut where Hezbollah is stationed." So, but that didn't happen. So it's gonna take a while, which means something actually. But I'll stop here and ask you, what kind of scenarios do you imagine? And I'll try to chime in later, because uh, there are a couple of potential scenarios. One that is um, a free for all, which means we can predict what's going to happen and there's no implicit understanding, and one where there is some sort of implicit understanding in response to those assassinations, whereby everything is kept under the threshold, even
Yes.
that threshold is being raised as we speak. Okay, I'll stop.
Well, I think it's a very good but also very difficult question. I was listening. I believe it was the Lebanese analyst Ali Haidar yesterday on one of the Arabic broadcasters, in which he made the point that neither Hezbollah nor Iran nor Israel um, are out to provoke a full scale war, but at the same time, each of them feels it needs to take actions that rise to a certain level, and that they are prepared to do so, even in the knowledge that those actions may produce a full scale war. So it's kind of let's say, continuum between intention and reality. I think Hassan Nasrallah's speech, the statements coming out of Iran, make very clear that there is going to be a response that is unlike what we saw, for example, in April, that this time is intended to be powerful, painful, and successful. Whether this will be coordinated among the members of the self styled Axis of Resistance, whether it will be separate or series of separate attacks. Will it be trying to shut down Haifa port, storm the Golan Heights, try to kill senior Israeli officials? I have absolutely no idea, and I have absolutely no grounds on which to speculate what might happen, except to say that I think, and on this occasion, those who have been making these statements have made clear that they intend to inflict a serious, strategic, and painful and direct response, rather than a symbolic, covert response. And that from their point of view, those who are now calling for restraint missed the boat first when they allowed Israel to launch these assassinations, and are now missing the boat again by constantly repeating that Israel has a right to defend itself and that their commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. In other words, um, uh, you want restraint, you want to prevent regional escalation and full scale war, well, then you need to control how Israel responds to our response, and don't have the illusion that you're going to be able to prevent our response. So, of course, we have to see the nature of the response, which I'm convinced is inevitable, probably not very long in coming, and is something that I suspect Israel will find it extremely difficult not to respond to, and will only refrain from responding to if it is prevented from doing so by its Western sponsors and allies, which is something I absolutely do not see happening. And then when Israel responds to the retaliation for its assassinations, um, then I think we're quite clearly sliding into a significant conflict. As I recently said, until these two assassinations, it had been my view that we can't really speak of an Israeli defeat. We can certainly speak of Israeli failure during the past 10 months. But that these past 10 months represent failure rather than defeat. My suspicion is that we're now entering a new phase where Israel really only has one of two options in terms of the outcome of this entire conflict. Either a crushing victory that leaves it in an unprecedentedly strong position in the region, or an unprecedented strategic defeat that will leave it in a position that is so weakened in the region that its future may well hang in the balance. And the other point I would make is I think Israel was in large part motivated by a desire to draw the United States directly into its armed confrontations with its enemies. And it sees in Biden the perfect tool for this. And particularly if he is succeeded by Trump, I think Harris, they have some questions about, but I don't think that's necessarily a key issue for them. But you know, they it has been Israel's primary aspiration for decades now to see a direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran, and I think they see the period between now and January of next year as presenting a unique opportunity to do so. And I think that's one more reason to fear for the very worst. Although I would add that I think Israeli illusions about U.S. power in the Middle East may well be in for a painful reality check. Certainly, if one compares uh, Washington's extraordinarily successes, if you will, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, I think the Israeli reliance on U.S. power to achieve its strategic objectives and its crushing victory, which will change the strategic picture of the Middle East, seems to me to be a very misguided one.
Does the story and development of these horrific incidents in the Israeli detention space of torture and rape, and then the response by some who wanted to defend those who were held, of course, in the end, not much came of it, and folks were, these perpetrators were, for the most part, released, and the kind of on the surface schism that we saw reflecting something much deeper also in various parts of Israeli society in terms of fissures and so on. None of them are about pro and con regarding Gaza and Palestinians, but they're internal. Does this have any bearing on how the war cabinet proceeds?
I
And,
don't think so. Sorry.
let me just add. Sorry, let me just add the uh, dramatic deterioration of the economic situation in Israel, as well as the continuing migration out of Israel,
Mhm.
as well as a number of other factors that perhaps require their own discussion
Yeah.
and conversation. But does anything as to what is going on inside Israel affect at this point, not in the first few months or even recently, but at this moment right now, where we are beginning to see discussions inside Israel about these matters, and where many of those internal discussions are not open to the public, by the way. is
Mhm.
is this going to have any, or does it have any effect, or not yet, or not at all?
I don't expect it will. And I think while the economic costs to Israel have been dramatic, and that, for example, the US providing Israel tens of billions of additional dollars, will obviously helpful, cannot compensate for lost opportunities, cannot compensate for decisions not to invest in Israel or to withdraw investments from Israel. But I think there's an important point to be made here, which is that one thing that has distinguished apartheid Israel from apartheid South Africa is that in apartheid South Africa, the objective was primarily economic hegemony and the exploitation of the indigenous population. And what that meant was that when in the 1990s, the white minority regime was offered the opportunity to maintain its economic position, if it would be prepared to relinquish its political hegemony, it was willing to do this. Israel is a very different kettle of fish. Israel is not about exploiting the native, the indigenous population. It's about removing them. And it's not about economic hegemony, but political supremacy. So, in contrast to South Africa, Israel is prepared to pay a very significant economic cost, if necessary, in order to maintain a Jewish supremacist political system. And
Or in addition to South Africa, because the idea is that it's X plus rather than X instead of Y.
yes, but if, in other words, in South Africa, when the white minority regime um, realized that it was confronted with very significant economic suffering, it was prepared to relinquish, let's say, the formal structures of white supremacy. In Israel, I think, you know, it's the supremacist regime that trumps economic motivation. And you see that most clearly in the current government and people like Netanyahu and Smotrich, and Ben Gvir, who are basically prepared to see the entire economy go up in flames, if they can do so. Um, uh, if by doing so they're able to expand settlements further and commit more genocide, and so on. So on that risk, and that on that level, my answer would be no. As far as your first point is concerned, I thought our friend Diana Butu put it best in an opinion piece she wrote for the website Zeteo, with the headline "Israelis riot for the right to rape Palestinians." You know, you're of course familiar with the phrase "every accusation is a confession." And we've had a whole series of rape hoaxes. A rape hoax that was specifically manufactured to legitimize and enable the genocide we've been discussing today. And now we see, well, yes, actually, there is systematic rape. Um, and it's being done not by Palestinians, not even by Israelis against Palestinians, but by Israeli interrogators and torture specialists against Palestinians in detention facilities. I mean, this is really a combination of Abu Ghraib and the Gestapo. There's absolutely no other way to describe it, and it's particularly disconcerting to see when you have had the Western media since October 7th, at every critical juncture where Israel appears to be heading for a major public relations disaster, um, regurgitate and reinvent this 7 October mass rape hoax. But then having virtually nothing to say about this horrific story that emerged last week. There's been more about it in the Israeli press than in the Western media.
Thanks, Mouin. This has been very illuminating. I know that we can talk about this for a lot more time. Um, but I will stop here because we are approaching the third hour, and we don't want to break the record, which is a little bit over 3 hours. Maybe we'll do it.
Let's keep that record.
Yeah, maybe we'll do it another time. Um, I don't have any final words. Sometimes I don't have any words at all. If you have any final words, do you want to leave any folks with any final comments?
Well, I let me first thank you, Bassam, for organizing this discussion and to again acknowledge and you know express my utmost respect for your indefatigability. And I think it's important that we all recognize um, that the story is increasingly, at certain stages, out of the public eye. And it is in those times that we most need to focus on it because this genocide is ongoing. As you mentioned a few minutes ago, Bassam, it is actually intensifying. And with respect to the last issue we discussed, the prospect of a full scale regional war, um, if and when bombs and missiles start raining down on Israel, on Lebanon, on Iran, and who knows where else, that's where all the headlines are going to be focused. And it is at that point that we should expect Israel's campaign against the genocidal campaign against the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip and its civilian infrastructure to reach unprecedented levels of intensity and horror.
الله لا يوفقك على الكونكلوجن.
Sorry, I want me to try again.
Can you do that again with something
Yes,
less somber؟ لا لا خلاص.
yes.
طيب okay. شكرا معين. Thanks to
Thank you.
everyone who's been watching. People on the comment section on YouTube, you guys are hard at work talking about things that are not being discussed in this conversation, at least some of you. We tried to keep the freedom of expression going. We did not ban anyone or touch the conversation on YouTube, but we do want to tell you that the moment people go beyond a threshold in terms of personal insults, there will be a warning and then there'll be some sort of an action. You could criticize Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Israelis, Americans, all you want, in terms of opinion about action. But once you begin insulting each other, or once you begin approaching racist language, we will have to remove you from the conversation. We tried not to do anything today because people kind of like approached the red line and went back. So, for the love of whatever you're into, just stay there. Don't cross that red line. The last thing we want to do is do to you what is being done to us in universities and elsewhere in the United States. Allah. Anyway, all right. Shukran Mu'in. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to everyone at
Thanks, everyone.
Gaza and Context and at all of the good institutions that are co-sponsoring these conversations. You can find out more at palestineincontext.org. Sorry, you can find out more at palestinecontext.org, which is on the right hand side of the screen. Please donate to unrwausa.org. We've had the representative or the person running the organization join us on Gaza on My Mind and share with us how the process goes and how this is actually one of the more effective ways to reach Gaza. And we have been able to ascertain this. We will be back with more conversations. Be safe, everyone. And those of you in the region, including myself and others, yeah, blaze for security and safety. Salam.
Thank you.
Hala, hala.